Evan, and welcome to a video on OCR History B Public Health 1500 to 1750, which is early modern Britain. So this is a content video which will go through all of the information that you need to know for this time period. Just a quick reminder again of our timeline that we have for people's health. So we have already looked at in a previous video 1250 to 1500, the 13th to the 16th centuries, which is medieval England. This video is going to be focused on early modern Britain, which is from 1500 to 1750, the 16th to the 18th centuries, and then there will be subsequent videos on industrial Britain, 1750 to 1900, the 18th and the 20th century, before finally moving on to modern Britain, which is 1900 to present day, the 20th and the 21st centuries. So on screen you can see an overview of each of the time periods and what the exam boards say that you need to know for each of these. The previous video looked at medieval Britain. This one is all about early modern Britain, 1500 to 1750. And you can see that the exam board will expect you to know social, cultural and economic change, including the growth of towns, changing living conditions, which includes housing, food, clean water and waste, responses to outbreaks of plague, including national plague orders and local reactions, and finally the impact of local and national government on public health, including measures to improve the urban environment and the government response to the Gin Craze 1660 to 1751. So the first thing that we need is an overview of early modern Britain. So one of the most significant features of this time period is religion. So in 1500 the country was still Catholic, with monasteries that were very, very rich. So monasteries being places where monks lived, extremely fervent Catholics. But by 1750, Henry VIII has split with Rome. So you'll know this from your Elizabethan studies, that Henry VIII wanted a divorce and the Pope wouldn't grant him this. So as a result, he establishes his own church, the Church of England, and changes the religion of England for the first time. We have a split within England between Catholicism and Protestantism. So after Henry VIII split with Rome, England has to become Protestant, and as a result of this, all of the wealth of the church had been taken by the state during what was known as the dissolution of the monasteries, which is where Henry VIII shut all of the monasteries down and took anything valuable from within them. So religion at this time is quite turbulent, but the majority of people are still extremely religious, just depending on whether they are Catholic or Protestant, both of which are obviously types of Christian. We then have Parliament and government. So by 1750, the end of our time period, Parliament had become much more powerful than the monarch. We had the English Civil War, which saw the king executed in 1649, and Parliament began to make new laws which affected people's lives. So despite Parliament making laws affecting the majority of the population, only 3% of the population could vote. So those laws are going to represent the desires of the wealthy rather than of the poor. We then have new technologies and discoveries. So people began to search for a scientific way of understanding the world. In the 1660s, we have Robert Hooke, who invents a powerful microscope. And we also have the printing press that was created right at the end of the medieval period in the 1470s. The reason that this is referenced here, despite it being slightly out of the time period, is because we see the impact of the printing press a lot more within early modern Britain, as a result of there being many more books and pamphlets available to people to read who are literate. We've then got farming and food. So bad harvests could still lead to starvation, the same as medieval Britain, with continuity there. But by 1750, there were improvements in farming, which meant that famine was less likely, despite the population doubling between 1550 and 1750 to nearly 6 million people. Towns during this time period are also growing in size, and they are becoming much more overcrowded. We've got mines that are opening in the northeast of England and coal is being shipped to London. This is all by 1750, so this is at the end of our time period. We start to have large amounts of sugar and tobacco which are coming to Britain from America and the Caribbean, and by 1750 these products were being traded to the British Empire, the East India Company and the slave trade. Finally, we have the alehouse, which is obviously the name for a pub, and the common people, such as the peasants and craftsmen, drank a lot of ale and beer. The number of alehouses grew dramatically as they became important meeting places where people could eat, drink, gamble, flirt, and smoke, often to excess. We're going to have a look at living conditions, and just a reminder that they are comprised of housing, food, water and waste, and we're going to start off by looking at housing. So first of all, accommodation was often crowded and damp, which led to lung problems and respiratory diseases, such as asthma, for example. We have, in the 16th century, inhabitants of many towns continued to live in medieval oak-framed houses. However, from the 17th century, these were replaced with stone or brick. You'll see throughout this PowerPoint that I've put the words change and continuity, which is obviously something that you could use for your 9-mark question, which will say, write a clear and organised summary that analyses and then gives you a topic. So I've tried to put that as much as possible throughout these slides. So the example that I've just given you of housing is a change from medieval. So from the 1600s, we can see houses being replaced by stone and brick, which is indicative of the change of materials at the time. So you could discuss that as a change if you were writing a paragraph on living conditions. In comparison, we've got some continuity, that houses in towns were still often just 1 room wide and 3 stories tall. Some had the same overhang that we saw in medieval England, so we have seen this before, so again, example of continuity. And poor families were squashed into cellars and upper stories, and sharing beds was common. So we've seen a change in the fact that people are starting to move to towns. The majority of people are still living in rural areas, but those who do live in towns do not have nice living conditions. So in terms of living conditions for water and waste, firstly we're going to start off with water, and we're going to have a look at the rich and then the poor. So wealthy people during this time period could afford to have piped water into their houses, but saying that, it was only the very wealthiest in society because this was a very expensive thing to do. This is a change. We haven't seen this in medieval England, so this is something very unique to this time period that you could reference in the exam. Water can still be bought from water cellars, which is continuity from medieval. Remember that a water seller accessed the water that they had from the conduits or rivers and brought it into towns in a large container. So we've got continuity with our water cellars. We've also got servants who took care of washing clothes, so they are using water for that. And we have bathtubs being used, using water heated by a fire. So again, this is only the wealthy people who are going to be having a bath. The poor will still be bathing in rivers, the same as they were in medieval England. They also start to use soap for the first time, which was made from olive oil for use on skin. So they're using this with water. So this is a step in the right direction in terms of improving cleanliness. In terms of the poor, we have the fact that they are still using water from free public water fountains that are brought in by the conduits, which is continuity. We have the option for them to buy water from a water seller if they can afford it, but remember that is very unlikely. We have people bathing in rivers rather than baths, which is again continuity from medieval England. And finally, they are using brushes on their skin, which is something called dry washing, as they believe that water could actually infect them through the pores in their skin. So this sounds like quite a convenient method of cleaning because they didn't have much access to water. So this idea of dry washing to them made sense, and it was also very convenient because they didn't rely on water to do it. So we're now going to have a look at waste. We have household waste and urine and excrement. We're going to have a look at the solutions that early modern Britain came up with and then how effective they were. So first of all, for household waste, we have scavengers and rakers who are collecting ash, food, waste and sweepings from houses once or twice a week. This is a change, and it should, if done regularly, improve the public health situation in early modern Britain. And we also have dunghills, which are being moved to the outside of towns. Obviously, that's not good if you live on the outskirts, but lots of people tended to live quite rurally or in the centre. So moving dunghills outside of the towns does show that they had an awareness that these weren't good things to have within the centre of a living space. In terms of effectiveness, household waste was effectively dealt with and rakers sold the waste to market gardeners. So again, we've seen this in medieval, the fact that waste is being used to kind of fertilise the ground. So it's being dealt with effectively here, and people are also making a bit of money from selling it on. In terms of urine and excrement, we have the flushing toilet invented in 1596. This is a big change, but it does only become popular towards the end of the time period, and it is with the very wealthy. The vast majority of people did not have a flushing toilet, partly because sewers weren't properly established and the piping work needed wouldn't have enabled many people to have access to this. But it's worth noting the date here, and this is an invention during this time period that you could reference. More likely, people had privies, which were toilets in sheds, and they were emptied into rivers if built nearby, or into cesspits, which could overflow. So this is a change really from medieval that we see, and this is the most common way that the rich used the toilet. We then have, in terms of the poor, that toilets were not for them. They were only for the rich, as we said, and I said it was limited access to water and drains. And privies and cesspits polluted rivers and wells with piles of excrement building up in the gardens, which was causing disease. So really, the poor here have the worst end of the deal. There'll be fewer privies for them to use, there'll be fewer cesspits, and all of that is then building up within the boundary of the property of the poor people. So the final part of living conditions is in relation to food, and we're going to have a look at the diet of the rich first of all, and then the effects that that diet had on these people. So first of all, the wealthy had a large variety of meats, such as beef and venison. Venison, remember, being deer. This was very similar to medieval Britain, and therefore is continuity. They also continued to eat white bread. They ate fish on Fridays, which again, remember, was the same with medieval. There was no meat consumed on a Friday. They had small quantities of salad leaves, vegetables and fruit. But there is a change here. Because of the increase in foreign trade, there were new foods such as peppers, pumpkins, chilies, tomatoes and potatoes. So there is starting to be more of a variation in diet, and also the wealthier you were, the more impressive it would be if you could invite people round and you were showcasing these new ingredients. So they do become increasingly popular during this time period. Finally, we have wine, ale, hot chocolate, coffee and tea, which are all being sweetened with sugar, which is from the slave plantation. So this is towards the end of this time period, and this is a big change, the fact that we do see sugar starting to be part of the rich person's diet. In terms of the effects of these, the diet was around 80% protein, so there was a lot of digestive problems due to the lack of variation, so lots of meat and fish being consumed by the wealthy. And we also have something called gout, which came from eating very rich foods. So by rich, we're not speaking about expensive, we're talking about the taste and the flavour of those foods. And this caused a lot of joint pain. This is a change that appears during this time period because of the richness of foods being consumed. We also have rotting teeth due to sugar consumption, and this is the first time that we see this because we don't have sugar, remember, in medieval England. And it's also the very start of obesity. Now, the vast majority of people wouldn't have become obese because the jobs that they would have done would have meant that they were moving around a lot. However, if you were very wealthy, you would have people to move around for you and do the kind of hands-on jobs. So it is the start of obesity, which comes from an increase in the amount of sugar that is being consumed. In comparison, we have the poor. So they were still eating mainly bread and vegetables, which is continuity from medieval. Remember, they tended to eat that rye bread. We have pottage as still being the most common food, which is that vegetable stew. And when bad weather ruined the harvest, the price of grain rocketed and labouring families struggled to buy bread. All of this is continuity. It's going to cause huge stress on the poor population in early modern Britain. Finally, we've got the poor would have access to eggs, cheese, fish and meat very occasionally. Again, the same as medieval. So there's a very limited variation in terms of the diet. It's a lot healthier than the diet of the rich people because there are so many vegetables being consumed, but it did lack vitamin C and iron as well, again continuing from medieval. And we also had periods of starvation if the harvest failed, which again is exactly the same as medieval Britain. So the epidemic that you need to know during this time period is the plague, not to be confused with the Black Death. So please make sure that in the exam you are clear that it is the Great Plague that takes place during early modern Britain. So if you have a look at the points that are on the screen, we've got the most serious outbreak of the plague was the Great Plague of 1665. So you would be expected to reference the name and the year of that. It was so terrifying because of how frequent it was. We also had awful symptoms such as blisters, temperatures of 40 degrees, headaches, vomiting, great thirst, and remember the water is not clean at this time, and buboes, which remember those huge boils that fill with kind of a black like pus. So very, very unfortunate conditions which would have made people extremely ill before they died. No one understood what was causing the Great Plague. This is very, very similar to medieval with the Black Death, and people don't understand what is causing it. People are still believing that it is God or miasma, which remember is this belief that there are bad smells that cause disease. However, by the end of the period, people started to think it might be caught through being in close contact with a victim, and that is a change and a step in the right direction. During this time period, we do actually see interventions from the government for the first time. So we're going to have a look at these three interventions that were introduced. The first being Henry VIII's proclamation. Now, as much as I said earlier that you need to remember the date of the Great Plague being 1665, if you can't remember 1518 for Henry VIII's proclamation, then please do not worry. It would be great if you could remember that it was him that introduced it. And let's have a look at the rules that he introduces. So first of all, he says that plague victims will be isolated within their own houses, that straw should be hung on the windows of infected homes for 40 days, that anyone in the house had to carry a white stick to identify them, and finally that people were to be isolated in pest houses outside of the city wall. So this is the first time that we see this idea of quarantine, which is the isolation of a victim from other people. So the ideas are definitely a step in the right direction from Henry VIII during this time. In terms of effectiveness, it does have limited effectiveness as it wasn't enforced everywhere, but it is definitely, as I say, this move towards isolation and measures that are going to help the population. We then see Henry's daughter Elizabeth introduce her Plague Act in 1578, and she introduces a few things. So barrels of tar being burnt in the street, obviously that isn't going to play a major part in improving conditions. This was because of the belief in miasma. There were special prayers that were said in church. Clothes and bedding of plague victims was burnt, and infected houses should quarantine for 6 weeks. Isolating, so building on from the work of her father really. In terms of effectiveness, superstition was definitely still present. We can see that in points 1 and 2. But isolating and burning belongings was definitely going to help slow down the spread. And there is starting to be a connection between dirt and disease. As much as that isn't explicit, that is clearly why they began to burn the clothes and bedding of plague victims. So again, another step in the right direction. Finally, we have the 1604 Plague Act. So this increased financial support for the families of the sick, and we have harsh punishments for anyone that was breaking the rules of isolation. So you can see there that it would be hanging for anybody that decided to break the rules if you were a plague victim. So if you have the plague and you decide that you are leaving your house, you could be hanged. If you are a healthy family member who has been in contact with a plague victim, you would still receive a punishment, and that would be whipping. In terms of effectiveness for this, isolation and the strict rules did help the disease to stop spreading so quickly, but the connection between fleas and the disease had still not been made. So we have three different ideas here of trying to reduce the impact of the Great Plague. But the key thing that we need to know here is that these are all the first examples we see of a national policy on public health. They are instructions that are given by the monarchs, and that is a huge, huge change from medieval in terms of how to try and deal with this disease that people at the time just simply did not understand. So let's have a look at the responses to the plague from individual people rather than from the government. So first of all, people went to church. So this is continuity. Just as in the Middle Ages or medieval time period, nearly everybody believed in God. And so they prayed that God would take the plague away. So this is, again, continuity from medieval Britain. People ran away or stayed, so only the rich could leave an infected town as they had other places to stay in the countryside. The majority of people would have had to stay where they were, which again is continuity from medieval Britain. People trying to find a cure. So this is a big change that we have, and this is probably the most common error that I have seen in essays being written about the plague and the Black Death. Lots of people referring to plague doctors within a medieval paragraph. So plague doctors do not appear until early modern Britain, and they were using sweet-smelling posies to fight against miasma. They dressed in heavy cloaks, hoods, and had leather beaks stuffed with herbs. You can see a plague doctor here in the corner, so this is what is being described. They also began to smoke tobacco, which became more popular, again because of the belief that it stopped miasma. And we do have physicians and apothecaries who also appear who claim to have cures for the plague. None of this worked, but there were people who believed that these plague doctors could cure them. So this is a big change from medieval Britain. People avoiding the sick. So we have, it became sensible to avoid people who were contaminated. Sometimes foreign immigrants were blamed, and so people avoided them. So this is a change. Remember, we have proclamations that come from monarchs which say really to avoid people who are contaminated. So you could link this in with the policies of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. And finally, people sticking together. So people did not usually abandon their families. They stayed together and they prayed that they would survive. So this is again an example of continuity. I just want to reinforce here that all of these beliefs really are based on the fact that there is no scientific knowledge in this period, exactly the same as medieval. So as a result of the lack of scientific knowledge, there is no real progress with how to tackle the disease. So if we were thinking about a point evidence explain link paragraph for a 10-mark question, for example, or for the essay question, your point would be that there was a lack of scientific knowledge, and then one of these sections could potentially be the evidence to support that argument. Another element that you could be asked about in the exam is what the authorities' responses were to try and improve public health, and we're going to have a look at this through the lens of towns. So first of all, we're going to have a look at York, which would be a really good example to reference in the exam. So in terms of York, first of all, they instructed people to clean up the area outside of their homes and not to put waste out for scavengers until after 7 p.m. Just a reminder here that scavengers collected waste. They are very similar to rakers. So this is a change. It's very kind of instructive in terms of when the waste is going to be collected, and this would hopefully improve the conditions in York. We have a system of fines that was introduced for any household which threw human waste into the street at night. So again, a change, a move in the right direction, something that we hadn't seen in medieval. They also encouraged people to have their cesspits emptied frequently. This is not compulsory, but again, the encouragement is evidence of the fact that the authorities are starting to intervene, which is a big change from medieval. In terms of other towns around the country, London, first of all, have water companies that bring in piped water into people's homes. We've spoken about the fact that it was only the rich could afford this luxury, but nonetheless, it is going to be cleaner water, which is going to improve public health for the wealthy. We also have, between the period of 1670 to 1750, that town centres improved. So there was more street lighting and large houses. Again, really, this is going to benefit the wealthier people in society, but it is a change that you could refer to in comparison to medieval Britain. Some streets were paved, which is a change from medieval England as well. However, the fact that it is the rich that are benefiting and the poor aren't is continuity from medieval. So there is no kind of effort really by authorities to improve the conditions of the poor in England. And cesspits and the problems associated with them continue to be a main feature of everyday life for both the rich and the poor, really. There is not an effective way yet to dispose of excrement and urine. We have the Gin Craze, which was 1720 to 1751, which is an event that you could be asked about, and I'm sure it's probably one of the events that you remember the most, so fingers crossed this does come up in the exam. In the source that you have seen in your lessons and that you can see on screen, William Hogarth depicts the horrors of a society addicted to gin. So you can see in the image you've got a baby who is falling away from her mother, who is too drunk to react. You've got emaciated people, so you can see this guy's rib cage in the bottom right, so he's clearly not eating enough and drinking too much. We've got coffins here, as you can see, and here, just literally in the streets with bodies being put in from people who have died through alcohol consumption. We've got a man hanging in the top building of, the top floor of the building that is on the right. And images like this and the reaction from people such as the temperance movement who were anti-alcohol really did encourage the government for the first time to intervene. So, first of all, why gin? So in 1689, Parliament had banned imports of gin to encourage British distilleries. And what this does is make gin quite widespread, which reduces the price. And as a result of this, you had kind of advertisements from the time that stated things like drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence. Which really reinforced the fact that people were being encouraged to drink as much alcohol as possible and that it wouldn't cost you very much at all. It was also available from a wide range of places, from cellars, attics and sheds, so people were selling gin without kind of any proper licence or any regulation, so this was causing huge issues as well. It allows people to escape the drudgery of everyday life. So life was hard during this time period, and kind of becoming completely intoxicated from gin was seen as an escape. So the effects that gin had: first of all, there was an increase in crime as a result of people being very drunk. It would have increased violence, for example. Street fights are more likely to occur if people are inebriated. We have an increase in the death rate because of the amount of gin that was being consumed by so many. We had many women as well as men who became addicted to gin. So some women drank while pregnant, which led to babies being born with deformities. So the nickname for gin at the time was Mother's Ruin. So an awful kind of drink for people to be consuming during this time, but nonetheless people were consuming it in really high amounts. So let's have a look at the government intervention and how effective that was. So the first government action that we saw is that from 1550, Town Council stated that alehouses, or pubs as we know them today, had to have a licence. In terms of the effectiveness of this, though, it was very limited. So there were lots of small, unlicensed alehouses, and as a result of this, the fact that places were supposed to have a licence was largely ignored by the population. The Gin Act of 1729 stated that it would be £20 for a licence fee for sellers and a 5-shilling tax per gallon per producer. 5 shillings today is around about 25 pence, so not the biggest deterrent really for people. In terms of its effectiveness, it was impossible to enforce due to the huge number of small gin shops, which were known as dram shops, which you might remember from your lessons. So the Gin Act of 1729, not particularly a large success. We then have the Gin Act of 1736, which increased the licence fee for sellers to £50 and introduced a 20-shilling, which is approximately in today's money £1, tax per gallon per producer. So the money is being increased in the hope that that would deter people from producing as much. Despite this, we see a really negative reaction from the public. So we had rioting against these laws, distillers were angry because it was limiting the amount of money that they could make, and many people simply started distilling gin in their homes illegally. So again, not successful in terms of a law that was brought in. The final law, and the one that I would really encourage you to revise for the exam, is the Gin Act of 1751. Now you will see here that I've highlighted the one in yellow, and that is because our time period for early modern Britain is 1500 to 1750. Despite that, you can only refer to the Gin Craze on a question that was asking you about early modern Britain. So as much as it's 1 year outside the time period, the exam board will normally, if they have the Gin Craze in a question, will take it up to 1751, which will alert you to the fact that you are able to use the Gin Act of 1751 as evidence, and this is the only time period that you could refer to it in. So please don't worry about the fact that it is 1 year out of the early modern Britain time frame. This act was the most successful, so it introduced very harsh punishments such as imprisonment for selling gin illegally, being whipped if you do this for a second time, and a third offence would lead to transportation to America and then later to Australia. So this is a real deterrent for many people, and as a result of that, we see a huge step away from laissez-faire for the government. They are intervening, and the final Gin Act had a huge success because people were consuming less gin. So if you are to know one Gin Act for the exam, please let it be 1751, and just refer to the fact that it's a step away from laissez-faire, which is a huge change from medieval. The government are intervening because there is a public health crisis due to the amount of gin being consumed. So finally, Year 11, I have included on screen the past paper questions that have appeared for the early modern Britain time period. So you are more than welcome to have a go at some of these questions. I'd really encourage you to do so. You can see there's never been a 10-mark question. There's only been one 9-mark question. Traditionally, the most common area for this to appear in is the 18-mark question, and that would the exam board would expect you there to compare early modern Britain to a different time period, as you can see on screen. So you've got 4 18-mark questions that have referred to early modern Britain directly, 1 9-mark and 2 1-mark questions. Just a reminder here, if you have a look at the 18-mark questions, you can see that at times the exam board will give you the dates. Other questions, they will give you the centuries, and some questions they will give you the named time period. So just a reminder, it is really important that you are aware of all 3 components that can make up the wording or the numbers of a time period for this exam paper. So the next video that I will be doing will look at public health in industrial Britain.